Welcome back. Today we are going to do another copy from John Sloan. This one was done in, I think it was 1931, but around that late 20s, early 30s. This is an etching, and he's posed the model next to his etching press. This is a late etching by Sloan, and he is really emphasizing the cross-hatching. Notice you can learn a lot by the way these lines are curving around the forms. So we're going to not draw the etching press, we're going to draw the figure. It's a beautiful contrapposto pose, which, as you will recall, means that the weight is mostly on this leg, which is locked, and there's much less weight on the other leg. You feel that heel is slightly off the floor. There is also a little bit of weight on the handle of the press, which accounts for why her head isn't centered above the weight-bearing leg. So there is a secondary support here. So we'll have to draw at least the handle of the press to give a sense of what's happening with that weight. So we're going to start with kind of a gesture drawing. This is how I would start this drawing if I was at a life drawing session and this was the pose. So I'm going to start with a sort of schematic of the skull in side view. Then I'm going to relate the mass of the skull to the mass of the rib cage. I'm going to be a little bit analytical today, probably more analytical than I would be in life. And I'm going to really try to relate like the sternum, the pit of the neck to the chin. So the pit of the neck is sort of a little bit behind the chin, and that's going to give me the origin of the sternum. So I'm looking at this relationship between the line of the face and the line of the sternum. We're orienting this, setting this back a little bit from here, and then I'm going to sketch the rib cage sort of around that form of the sternum, noticing that most of the rib cage is to the left of the sternum because of the angle at which it's turned. After a while, you sort of don't have to measure the size relationship between the skull and the rib cage. You just should get an instinctive sense of how those forms relate to each other in scale. Then we're going to move our way down, and we're looking for the mass of the pelvis. There's a little twist to this figure. So see how this line between the abdominal muscles is moving slightly around towards center. So the pelvis is facing us a little more than the rib cage is. And the pelvis, you want to get a sense that the pelvis is tilted a little bit forward, just as the rib cage is tilted a little bit back. The neck is forward again, and you're trying to get used to that alternating pattern of movement. As I mentioned, the center of gravity or center of balance should originate right around the ear, and it's just a little bit, it lands a little bit to the left of the heel there. You see that? So let's draw that, and that's going to help us place the legs correctly. And let's also take one measurement. you can see this indentation right here. This gives us a really clear idea of where the trochanter of the femur is. And this is where the bottom of this heel is. And here's the top of the head. So what we would expect is for this distance and this distance to be roughly equal. If I take a measurement right off the screen here, I can see that the zone above the trochanter is just a little smaller than the zone below the trochanter. That could often happen because maybe she has long legs, but in this case, it's because her head is tipped downward. So if her head was fully straightened up, these would be exactly equal. So I'm going to just make sure I've got a little more room here than I have here. There's really nothing more important in a figure drawing than finding your center and being accurate about that. Because, as I say, every time we do this, the most embarrassing mistakes in figure drawing usually involve making the legs way too small. And it's kind of sad to see how many people just keep making that mistake, despite years of practice. So if we know where the heels are, this heel is actually slightly further down than the one I measured to. You can see that we've got to place this heel just a little bit to the right of the center of balance. And so we end up with something like that for the leg that's on to our right, her left leg. This leg is what we call hyperextended. Which means that it is so when a limb is flexed, it's like this, right? That's flexing your leg. Extending the leg is making it completely straight. And hyperextension is making it a little bit past straight when it's locked like that. And we do have the ability to hyperextend our legs, and that's when they feel like they're in locked position. And you see that? You need to learn to recognize that it's not this or this. It's like just a little bit the other way. So that's sort of what we see here. And that hyperextension of the leg does allow you to bear more weight. Okay, so this other leg is relaxed. I'm going to start with the kind of a stick figure. And remember, our heel on this side is going to land on this line that we made. Now, when I'm drawing the figure, I'm going a little faster, and I'm not trying to talk out loud about what I'm doing, so it's going to be a little. It gets fun when it's a little more spontaneous than this, but I'm trying to explain some of the thought processes so that you can learn to think about things in a useful way. Like what I have on the page right now would be equal to like a 1 or 2 minute gesture drawing, and we're probably 5 minutes into this video already. So we're gonna do the gesture of the arm. Well, first let's identify the angle of the shoulders. This would be an easy thing to get wrong. You see that angle is probably about 20 degrees sloping downward. A lot of artists check their angles, like you can see me do right now. I can hold my pencil at an angle in front of the figure like that, and then hold it in front of my drawing and make sure that I got the angle the same. That's obviously something you can only do if you're working at an easel. Doesn't work too well if you're staring at your sketchbook on the tabletop. That's one of the huge advantages of working at an easel. Here's the gesture of this arm, sort of originating at this shoulder like that, and this arm is doubling back and landing at the top of the, sort of resting on the iliac right here. And this wrist is, there's part of the beauty of this drawing is this symmetry between this downward slope of the shoulders and the upward slope of the hands. So let's go ahead and indicate that upward slope, and that's going to help us get the wrist in the right place over here, with this hand sort of disappearing behind the pelvis. And like that. So that is pretty much the gesture. I'm going to repeat myself again and say that, you know, the sign of a good gesture drawing is if you could show somebody the drawing and they could assume that pose, that means you've captured the gesture, all the information that's relevant to the gesture. And it should look like she's carrying her own weight, but just a little bit of the weight is sort of on this printing press support. So I think we're in pretty good shape to move into detail. Okay, so we're gonna zoom in on the face now. And as we've seen in other etchings by Sloan, this is very simplified. There's just a few lines that get this likeness and expression. We can start by placing the eye about halfway down, like that. The indent for the bridge of the nose is right in front of the eye. If you want to measure something, the eyebrow, bottom of the nose, and bottom of the chin. So the bottom of the nose is about halfway between the eyebrow and the bottom of the chin. And the mouth is about a third of the way down between the bottom of the nose and the bottom of the chin. Got this exaggerated Cupid's bow curve. Fairly deep indent under the bottom lip. Here's the facial angle. Notice that the chin is set back quite far from the bottom lip. And the neck comes from behind the bottom part of the chin. There's a little hint of the cheek. And she's got pretty big hair, so we're going to be extending out past the skull that we blocked in earlier. Here's the trapezius muscle. It's coming down and disappearing behind the collarbone. Collarbone from this angle is very straight, just goes across like that. And the muscles of the neck are very defined in this pose. And here's the curve of the deltoid muscle for the shoulder. And here's the curve of the other deltoid. So remember, this was our general sense of where the rib cage is, but here we've got the shoulder blade and the latissimus dorsi muscles, and like a lot is kind of filling out this volume. So we're extending out further back here. So that's this first curve, is that muscle group. And the second curve, the one under that, is the rib cage. There's something really cartoony about this drawing. There's certain exaggeration of the anatomy, but that can be really useful to copy because he obviously understands the anatomy very well. And he's trying to create a drawing that's expressive of the anatomy without being photorealistic. This is an instance of where it's probably useful to look at the negative shape. Anytime you see these openings between arms and legs and torsos. It can be really useful to think of those as abstract negative shapes. And I can see I need to open up a little more space here between these forms. And here I'm just sketching the shape that I see. For reasons that we've discussed before, the best measure of an artist's skill is their ability to draw the figure and the portrait. And the best way to learn to do that is to copy the work of other artists a lot. And actually internalize your sense of the anatomy so that you're not stuck only drawing what you see, but you're drawing your understanding of what you see. And until you know the names of these muscles and you know how they, sort of what they do and where they tend to fall, you're going to be stuck just copying what you see without any understanding, and your ability to do a truly graceful or beautiful figure drawing is going to be extremely limited. And until you understand the underlying forms, your ability to draw a really good clothed figure is also going to be very limited. So look at the beautiful transition here between the wrist and the body of the hand resting on this printing press thing, and then the foreshortening of the hand as it's kind of reaching around behind there, a little hint of the beginning of the fingers. And this hand is also foreshortened with just this little hint of the fingers curling around. So I want to call your attention to the fact that the pelvis is tipped. Remember, the weight is on the hyperextended leg to our right. So the iliac crest here is higher than the iliac crest on the other side. You see that? So there's a tilt to the pelvis like that. And the iliac crest is where these gluteal muscles insert, so pretty easy to identify. So there's the tilt of the pelvis. There's a really subtle plane change right here between the external oblique and the gluteal muscles. Here's the linea alba, which is the separation between the two sides of the abdominals. And you can see a little shadow here of the bottom of the rib cage. And we're going to scroll. So here we see Sloan exaggerating another thing we talked about, which is when you have a swelling outward on one side of a human limb, you're going to typically see an indentation directly opposite it. So here we've got, this is going in here, and this is going out here. This is going in here, and this is going out here. You see that? And what we're trying to avoid is the beginner mistake of drawing our limbs like this. You put those indentations directly across from each other, and it doesn't look like it's a compromised structure, right? When you have the muscles doing this, that's where the strength comes from. This muscle group is coming down below the joint, this muscle group is coming up above the joint, and that's where strength comes from. If you had indents like that at the same level, you would have no strength and no ability to move. So Sloan is exaggerating that just a little, I think, but here's an indent on this side of the thigh, swelling down here. Here's a swelling here and an indent here. And these are things that you notice much more when drawing a copy of a master drawing or a master print like this than you would notice from life. Again, because he's exaggerating it a little bit. Here's an indent here, followed by a swelling down here behind the knee. And here's the swelling here, followed by the indent above the knee. And as we come down here, here's the first place where we really have swelling on both sides, because this is basically the muscles of the lower leg are just tapering down towards the ankle. And very foreshortened foot. When you're dealing with a foot that's coming right towards you like this, think about the geometry that you're seeing. And notice that the entire foot from the bottom of the ankle to the toes fits really neatly inside a square. And when you look at your feet, you see a long rectangle. So by drawing this square and forcing yourself to fit that foreshortened foot into the square, you're going to avoid a lot of the pitfalls that usually happen when people are trying to draw feet. So we got 5 toes. We've got a plane change, shadow edge right here. And that's sort of what that foot looks like. And the other foot, we already located the heel. This foot is less foreshortened. There's a really subtle kind of exaggeration of the form of the toes. And I didn't measure and I made that foot a little too big. I'm gonna pull those toes back a little. More like this. Okay. We're now going to do some more internal contours for the shadow map. So here's where the light breaks across this leg. I'm going to draw these lines a little darker than I normally would so you can see what I'm doing. And here's where the light breaks across the other leg. And the whole figure's mostly in shadow, but we've got some shapes of light on the torso. It's honestly a very weird lighting situation. A few shapes of light along the arm. A little bit of light on this arm. And very clear light across the face. So once we have those internal contours, we can do a pretty aggressive first shading. This back in the frame. Okay. So I'm left-handed. I'm shading this way. You'll notice there's very little first shading in Sloan's original here. This is almost all contour shading, but we don't have time to do that much contour shading, so we're going to get things going with a nice, easy, monodirectional kind of first shading just to set up our values a little bit. And the goal here is always just to get to where we can read our drawing in terms of volumes. And even though the light is poor and hard to read, you can see that just doing that, we can definitely start to see the volume in the figure in a way that we couldn't a minute ago. And now we're going to take a look at some of Sloan's very mannered approach to shading. And the word mannered comes from the term mannerism, which was a term came out of the post-Renaissance period in our history, when artists were developing their own unique styles of doing things. The more an artist exhibits style, the less true the artist can be to nature, right? Like photographs don't have style because they are absolutely true to the patterns of light and dark that are presented to them. So the more stylistic your work becomes, or mannered, the less realistic it's going to be. It can still be very expressive of realism, but it's not realistic. And I think you can see how because this work is fairly mannered, because Sloan has a kind of a unique style of hatching, it would be easy for me, even if I didn't know this was a Sloan, to recognize it as a Sloan. And that's only true because he's drawing in a certain style. And his mannerisms are very much about describing the forms through curved hatching marks, almost like an engraver. And I believe he did experiment with engraving a little bit as well. And so as we start hatching our final hatching, we're going to be shading a little darker, and we're going to try to curve our lines the way he did. And this is really a discipline, training your hand to follow the form as if you were touching it, as if your hand is like wrapping around the forms. And it's essential to learn how to do that especially if you ever want to make a print, because when you're printing, you have to rely on hatching for all your tonal work. So I'm not going to talk as much. We're just going to, and we're not doing a really close copy where we're trying to draw every line, but let's just try to shade this with a little bit of the spirit of the original. And just have fun with it. Just try to make your hand move in more or less the way his hand moved. And remember, if you're at a life drawing class, the chances that you're going to do these things with your hands, the chance is zero. Because when you're looking at a live person, you're not going to think to do these sorts of things with your hand. So that's where copying a work like this not only teaches you a lot more about the anatomy, because the anatomy is clearer, but it teaches you so much about mark making. You can't learn about mark making from life, because life does not suggest any particular way of making a mark. Only learn mark making from copies. And the main reason that art around the world got so bad in the 70s and 80s was because of a foolish idea that it was really bad to copy other people's work, because you would never develop your own style if you copied other people's work. And I really have come to believe the opposite is true. Like, the only way to develop your own style is to really analyze and understand and copy the styles of others. Very few artists are ever going to develop their own style just from studying nature. Look at this lower abdomen. The hatching here is curving very subtly this way around the form, and then cross-hatched this way around the form. The little indication of the navel right around the level of the iliac crest. Little darkening here at the boundary of the abdominal muscle. A weird kind of emphasis on the highlights in this drawing. It makes her look a little shiny. Really subtle reflected light coming along the gluteal and thigh muscles over here, with more of this curved hatching describing the muscles. And please believe me, you can get so much out of even doing a really bad copy. And this is probably not one of my best, but it is always the case that when you've done a copy, you can tell yourself that you've seen the whole drawing. Very subtle movement here around the kneecap. There's really two areas of fullness around the kneecap. One is the kneecap itself here, and there's another area of fullness under that, which is the fat pad that's pushed out by the head of the tibia. And there's a subtle darkening of the core shadow along the front of this lower leg. I feel like I didn't map this quite right. I gotta move that edge over slightly to the left. Here again is a subtle boundary between the kneecap up here and the fat pad underneath and the head of the tibia. And a little suggestion of a cast shadow on the ground. Not very strong because it feels like the whole ground plane is in shadow. And we'll try to do a little bit of wall shading just to study the hatching directions here. Notice real emphasis on vertical shading on the wall. Vertical hatching on the wall, and orthogonal hatching on the ground. You see that? And this is something that does not come naturally to anyone. Orthogonal shading, you really have to learn perspective first. Learn to think about where the vanishing points are. There's more orthogonal shading on the wall. There is no orthogonal shading in nature. You never see orthogonal shading in a photograph. It's a total invention, but it really helps to define this plane in a way that makes it very concrete for the viewer. And in addition to these two main shading directions on the wall, we also have cross-hatching diagonal to them, but in a way that creates a pattern that actually the crisscrosses, I think, follow the orthogonals. There was a very influential book on drawing published in the, I think the 60s, called The Natural Way to Draw, that really set off the movement of really not teaching drawing so much as just letting students discover drawing for themselves, as if they would all learn how to do it well by just trusting their instincts. But I would argue that drawing is about as natural as tap dancing. And that doesn't make it bad. Things don't have to be natural to be good. It's about as natural as playing golf. Like there's a lot of amazing things that people learn to do. Ballet, none of these things are natural, and drawing isn't either. It's all technique and practice and study. And that's what makes it distinctively human and unnatural and still beautiful, because it's our nature to do these unnatural things in a way. Okay, well, that's a little awkward, but gets a little bit of the vibe of the original. And gave me a chance to study it in a way that I had not before, so. So thanks as always for watching it. That's gonna do it for this video. We'll have a little more time to finish in class.